Right, let's turn our attention to the BBC now, shall we? Because there has been an awful lot of criticism about the BBC, about its failure to act, the governance over the BBC. It's obviously had to deal with a snap election, a change in government, a new Tory leader as well. Also, a change in political direction. There are lots of calls for the BBC to be defunded. Has the BBC actually lost its way? It seems to me that it doesn't seem to understand public sentiment very well, and it lurches from one crisis to another. Well, joining me now is Roger Bolton, who's a former BBC executive. Good morning, Roger.
Good morning.
Really good to talk to you. I mean, look, the BBC has actually not had a great year, I think it's fair to say. We saw the Hugh Edwards scandal, of course. We also saw Greg Wallace biting the dust. We saw the gaffe that Laura Kuenssberg made by sending her briefing notes to Boris Johnson, and that interview was then cancelled. I think one of the biggest things, and look, I'm a big fan of the BBC when it gets things right, but it seems to me things like staff salaries, Gary Lineker, just spiralled out of control, and there was very little governance.
Well, where should we start? And by the way, I don't represent the BBC.
No, indeed, but you did work there.
Right, but anyway, are the BBC getting anything right? Well, they got Christmas pretty well right, didn't they?
Did they?
Look at Wolf Hall, look at Gavin and Stacey, looking at Outnumbered, looking at the coverage of Carol from Kings. I mean, that's all pretty good. Now, obviously, what's been happening across the industry is a real financial crisis. The BBC's finances back down in real value terms of spending power by over 30 to 35%. So they've had to cut back quite dramatically. Same with ITV. ITV did that wonderful programme about Mr. Bates and the post office.
Yeah.
It never made its money back. So there's a general problem across the industry. Too many outlets, too little money. That's very difficult. When you get to the BBC, you know, when the country's divided, as somebody said in the past, the BBC's on the rack because it has to represent all the country, and nobody's particularly happy with it. It's had a bad year, not a terrible year. It has got a new chairman. It is trying, I think, genuinely to improve its coverage. And look at what it's doing in the coverage of Syria and the Middle East now. I think that's superb. But I think the crucial thing is this. We shouldn't be talking in this next year or two with the BBC's charter coming up about the BBC. We should start by saying, is there a role for public service media anymore? If there is, if we want it, is the BBC the best way of delivering it? And then how do we pay for it? So don't start with the licence fee. Start with, what do we want it for? And I would say, and I support public service media, what about children's programmes?
Well, we will talk about children's programmes, actually, because obviously Rowena Benjamin has waded in. She's also said that children's programming has lost its way. I would agree with that. I worked in children's programming at the BBC. I worked on Newsround, which was the only news programme for children.
Well,
but also,
let me start on that. First of all, congratulations for you on Newsround.
Well, thank you very much.
Secondly, that you will know that the BBC still produces most, if not all, of the original children's programming. The problem is across the industry and elsewhere, and the too great a dependence on American cartoons and elsewhere. So what we need a conversation about BBC's future is to say, right, BBC, if you're going to continue to exist, one of the key things you need to deliver are children's programming, original children's program. Nobody else is doing it particularly. Right, go and do that. That's a priority for you. I think there needs to be a public debate about what we want from public service and then decide how to deliver it. Now, I would say in the end, the BBC is worth supporting, and the licence fee is increasingly difficult to support because it's regressive. But you look at all the alternatives, it's difficult. For example, if you took advertising, it put you out of business and others out of business, and the rest of the industry is saying, please don't let the BBC take advertising, it'll destroy us. There are lots of problems with every way you pay for it.
But hang on a minute, isn't the issue here about core services? I think the BBC has made a couple of huge mistakes. One is merging international and domestic news. I have no interest in some of the stories they're now peddling. So, for example, we know that the news output has changed. BBC Verify has not worked in the way that they hoped it would do. And also, I just wonder, are they spreading everything too thinly? Why don't they concentrate on core services, which essentially is how the BBC was founded?
Well, I would say that I agree with a great deal of that. I don't agree actually with what you're saying about news, but I do agree about spreading things too thinly. What the BBC has tried to do is accommodate this reduction in income by slicing everything. And I think you've gone as far as you can. And I think now that's why I argue for a public debate about what are the core services you want the BBC to deliver. But I do believe one of those core services is news. I do believe...
No, I do too. But I want to see more domestic news. What they've done is they've actually watered down the offering.
I think there's always been well, I think they've had to cut back inevitably. But I think where another point is true is that I don't think they've reported this country in all its complexity in the way they've reported the rest of the world. And I think in Brexit and in the general election, you could see that the BBC News coverage was a little bit out of touch with the rest of the country. I think that needs to be adjusted. But do we want public service? By heaven, we do. Look what they're doing in the States. Look what we're getting. Look what we're getting from social media. We need someone we can trust. We need an organization we can trust. We need an organization that will say, for our children, we want good children's programs. We want to have science programs. We want to have things about engineering. We want to have a place where everybody can talk and feel free to say what they think.
What would you say to people who say, well, look, if the offering is so good, why don't we then turn to a subscription model?
Because if you go to subscription, maybe up to 5 million people will be switched off because they don't have direct access. If everybody was online, that might be an option. But the problem also is, with subscription, is the money tends to go where the majority of viewers are or listeners are. That's what tends to happen. And you don't want a situation in which we have lots of one sorts of programs. And by the way, Netflix and Apple and everything else are doing wonderful programs, but of a type. We want to say, if public service, what about the other areas? What about the room for experimentation? What about writers? Where can they go if they want to start writing? Are the BBC going to help? Where can people trial comedy? I mean, one of the great shames of the last few years has been BBC 4 and BBC 2, where you could have comedies tried out if they work for BBC 1, have gone. So let's have the debate and then decide how we pay for it and whether the BBC is the right organisation.
Roger, always good to talk to you. Thanks for your time and Happy New Year, Roger.